Ian Lesser, Vice President for Foreign Policy at the German Marshall Fund, joins me now from Brussels. Ian, thank you very much for being with us. Will Europhiles be relieved or concerned by the results that we've seen?
Well, I think they're going to be somewhat relieved, for two reasons. I mean, first of all, the sort of anti-EU bloc in the European Parliament, while probably a little larger, will be very fragmented. And the moderate parties, the Europeanists, didn't really do that badly. So in that sense, it will come as a relief. The other thing that I think is quite important is that there was a lot of attention. There's a lot of focus on Europe. There's a lot of focus on the European project, and I think that's something to note as well.
Reconcile these competing trends. It wasn't as good of a night for the nationalists as was feared initially by some in the EU, but they still did have a fairly strong showing, as did pro-European parties. So what now as the EU goes forward? It's hard enough trying to manage the interests of 27, 28 member states, but when they have to deal with these competing trends of Euroscepticism and wanting deeper integration, how are they going to address that?
Well, there are going to be some very hard decisions to be made. I mean, first up, there are going to be choices about the key positions across the European institutions. It's going to be harder and harder to make those kinds of decisions, in a sense, in a back room without reference to the wider European public. After all, there were very high levels of turnout historically for these European elections. So a lot of people will be focused on it. The public opinion piece of it is very strong. It's going to be harder to do these as sort of quiet deals. So there's going to be a much more open debate about those positions. The other point to consider, I think, is not just the sheer numbers in Parliament on one side or the other. It's a question of fragmentation versus solidity. And I think here you will see a kind of pulling together of parties, the Greens, the Liberals, centrists on the conservative side and socialists as well, who basically have an idea of moving Europe forward. And I think it'll be harder for the nationalists and populists, as well as they did, to move their own agenda. But we'll have to see.
Speaking of tensions, but on a slightly smaller scale, the results from the United Kingdom are equally confusing in that the Brexit party has soared to around 30% of the vote, but then there was an incredibly strong showing for the Liberal Democrats, a party that has an unambiguous position on wanting a second referendum and to remain in the European Union. How concerned or focused are other European countries and people still on Brexit? Because it's obviously dominating discussion here in the UK, where I am.
Well, Brexit is part of the agenda, to be sure, but I do think there has been a certain Brexit fatigue over recent months, simply because of the impasse that has been reached. I think there's a lot of frustration here in Brussels, and it's broadly felt across the political spectrum. And I think this sort of rather intense focus on what comes next after the European elections here in Brussels is going to make it harder, in a way, for Europe to produce anything new on the Brexit side. So I think, in a sense, the ball is as it was, but even more profoundly back in Britain's court.
Ian, just in a sentence or two, if you can, how are the results that we're seeing this morning going to change Europe over the next year or two?
Well, the first point, I think, is that there's simply going to be a lot more focused on what Europe should be doing. Again, in the past, these European elections were something of a second-order issue. They were not big news. They are big news now, and they're big news because all over Europe, people are thinking in a much more focused way about what they want Europe to be. And for some, of course, they want the European Union, in a sense, to go away. That's not going to be the result, of course. But so I think that's number one. There's going to be a lot of public focus, and these sort of sharp issues about sovereignty versus Brussels, about nationalism versus multilateralism, all of these things, which we also see on the other side of the Atlantic, are going to be really at the fore and important to the debate. But the key thing next will be who will be chosen for these key positions of European leadership here in Brussels.
Yes, we'll be keeping an eye on that. Ian Lesser, thank you. Vice President for Foreign Policy at the German Marshall Fund. Thanks very much for your time.